Good afternoon. Today we have a webinar on telling and narration and dialogue with Bob Doerr. He's an award-winning author, grew up in a military family, graduated from the Air Force Academy, and had a career of his own in the Air Force. Bob specialized in criminal investigations and counterintelligence. A full-time author with 23 published books, Bob was selected by the Military Writers Society of America as its Author of the Year for 2013. His most recent book, Curiosity Can Kill, was awarded a gold medal in 2024 by the Public Safety Writers Association. Bob lives in Garden Ridge, Texas, with Lee, his wife of 52 years, and Cinco, their ornery cat. Bob, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jim. I'm happy to be here this afternoon. And I made the title for my presentation suitably broad. I'm assuming you all can see it up there on your screen because it captures a wide range of topics. I can add or take away slides to fit my purpose. Don't worry, though. Our discussion today will be much more limited. For the most part, we'll be talking about point of view, or POV, and dialogue. See if that slide comes up. Okay, good. First, let's talk about point of view. It's an absolute necessity for a writer to determine which point of view he or she wants to use before they start writing. And once you've selected the point of view you want, use it and stay with it and do it correctly. Now, what is point of view? I'm assuming that most of you know what it is if you've been writing for a while, but still, it's who is telling the story. And I've heard this is one way to explain what POV is, but I prefer to say through whose eyes and mind is the story being told. Most stories are written in the first person point of view or the third person point of view. Some say you could write one in the second person point of view, but I've always found this to be very difficult. And most authors I've talked to who tried it stopped trying it and went back to either first or third before getting too far in their writing. I don't believe one way is better than the other, but what's important is that the writer believes in the choice of POV that they choose. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you start writing, you need to pick which point of view you want. And then as you go through your writing, you ought to feel all the way through the book if it's the best way to tell your story. I may not be making too much sense there, but you should get a feel for if the point of view you've taken fits your story and you like it. I've talked to a couple authors or have heard them talk about how they had to change their point of view halfway through and they started rewriting their book from a different point of view, simply because they thought it would be a better way to tell their story. Like I said, there's no right or wrong way. It's whatever you choose, and then stick to it and do it the best you can. In first person, the story is being told by the main character. That's the way about the protagonist or whatever. In the Sherlock Holmes is a good example because in that case, think of Watson. He's the one telling the story, even though the story is about Sherlock Holmes. There's Ishmael in Moby Dick. He's telling the story from his point of view, and so forth. As an example, the first person point of view would probably start off with something like this. I woke up to the sound of thunder. In other words, you'll see the word I a lot in it. I like using first person point of view, and I use it in my Jim West mysteries. And I also like reading books written in first person point of view. And I especially like listening to the old radio talk shows, mysteries, where it's written in the first person point of view. Okay, third person point of view is taking it from one of the characters, your main character, and everything is being told from his eyesight or his eyes, his mind, his voice. A good example of that would be instead of I woke up to the sound of thunder, it would be Clint woke up to the sound of thunder. And then from then on, you're telling it, the story from Clint's viewpoint. And of course, there are variations on these models. The most common being third person limited or third person omniscient. In limited, the story is limited to what your main character sees, hears, and experiences. In other words, if your main character doesn't hear it, see it, or feel it, or smell it, it doesn't really happen in the story. In third person omniscient, the writer can get into the character more than just one character's head. You think of Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, To Kill a Mockingbird. In those stories, different chapters were written from a different character's point of view. This is a fine way to tell a story. I think personally it's one of the best ways to tell a story because as the author, you have the ability to, to know what's in everyone's head. But you have to be very careful. See if we get another slide up here. There's a number of pitfalls you can get into with third person omniscient. As you start bouncing around to whose point of view you're telling the story from, you can really confuse the reader. And the biggest one is what's commonly called head hopping out there. And that's where you mix different characters' point of view without making it obvious to the reader. You'd have a chapter coming from Frank's point of view, and all of a sudden, Sally, who's another character in there, you start putting in her thoughts and what she sees and everything. And it can start confusing the reader who's actually telling the story, what's really happening here. So you have to be careful. There's nothing wrong with going back and forth, but you have to make it very distinct breaks. I recommend personally, I recommend starting a new chapter whenever you want to change the point of view of the story. In other words, have Frank have his chapter, and then you can start another chapter with Sally, and then she can say from her point of view what's happening. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. The whole point of doing it is to try to make the story more enjoyable for the reader, and you don't want to lose them or confuse them. Some people will say it's okay just to put a series of dots or dashes in the middle of a page to show a break in the point of view. I don't really like that because it can still get confusing, and you can break up the chapter from start to finish to making sense, or you can break up the flow somewhat. So it may be appropriate, you may want to do it, but I always recommend just start a new chapter. Okay, and there are other examples of point of view that people have taken or done. I don't know if there's really any right or wrong. What experts will tell you, stick with first or third, and then don't bounce around in people's heads. But a good example is that there's a book, The Girl on the Train. It was a major international bestseller, but it was written in multiple first-person point of view. Went from one chapter to two chapters to chapter three, and it all started off with I, but in each one is a different character. I didn't understand what was going on, had me totally confused. I almost stopped reading the book until I realized that the title of each chapter wasn't just about somebody. It told you whose point of view you were coming from, but it wasn't explained anywhere. So I just didn't know who I was. I assumed from the first page to about page 50, we had one person as being I, when it was really three people. Again, everything I've ever learned up to that point was you don't do that, but she did it and she got away with it, so it works. But I would recommend, unless you're a famous author, probably not to try anything too strange with point of view. Another thing that you can do, and this I've seen, and you especially see it in movies and TV shows and so forth, but in books, is it may be written in first person point of view for most of the book, but you have a chapter here and a chapter there that is coming from some third person's point of view. That can be done, again, especially if you have a chapter break, because right away the reader will understand this is coming from someone else's point of view. And you have to kind of make that easy to understand in the first paragraph or two also. This type is also used quite a bit in what I would call thrillers or horror shows, where you have a person. It could be told from anyone's point of view, but basically, you've got something they know what's going to happen to them. It's a suspenseful thing, and you all of a sudden it flashes to a short paragraph, and it's from the bad guys, the killers, the vampires' point of view or whatever, whoever it is. So you build tension, and then finally at the end, uh, you get a climax, and it can be done. Again, all these things you own the book, you own the style you want to write in, but the key is don't confuse the reader. Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit more time specifically on dialogue in a second, but dialogue can also confuse the reader if you don't know as the author, if you don't make sure when there's crowds or more than two people in a conversation or in a room, that you specify who's saying what. And what I mean by that is if it's in this chapter is from Frank's point of view, and you have Frank and Julie and Stevie, Susie all talking together, if you say something in the dialogue, say by Susie, and it's not something she should know because everything you've seen so far is that Frank is the only person that knows all this stuff. You have to somehow be aware of that, either explain why Susie knows it or don't accredit it to her. It's easy to do. It's easy to confuse your reader when they think, well, wait a second, Susie didn't go on that trip. That was Frank. How would Susie know this? And if you don't explain it, it can get real messed up. And then same thing with body language and actions. And that's just if you as an author don't have a good understanding of which characters in your book have the limp, have the lisp, have something else in their behavior, always scratching their nose or something. If you change that, you can confuse the reader because if you have Susie with the limp the whole way through, and all of a sudden Beverly has a limp in one section of the book because you forgot, that'll mess things up. It's not so much the point of view in this case, but it's mixing up characters with other characters. Okay, you don't want to do that. You need to always be careful when you go back and reread to make sure you've attributed the right actions, the right dialogue, and the right body language to the right characters. Bottom line, be careful with your POV. Stick with the basic rules until you have a lot of experience. Dialogue. Let's spend some time talking about dialogue because it's something I really enjoy writing. And it's the one area that most of the other young authors, I say young, new authors, talk to me about. This is an area they have a lot of trouble with. It's hard for them to create dialogue, and it shouldn't be hard. Okay, what is dialogue? Very simply put, it's the written conversation between characters in your story. It's set apart by quotation marks. I have here hello. And the speaker is identified so the reader knows who says what. Let's talk about this for a second. You have to always say who says what? No. If it's Susie and Frank talking, if you have Frank says this, then the next one's got quotes but doesn't say who said it. They probably think it's a response from Susie and all. But you do have to pay attention. You don't have too many segments of dialogue that don't explain which one of the characters is saying it. And then if you have multiple people in a conversation, it's good to list each time. An example where you don't have to do it maybe if it's Frank and Clint and Susie, and rather than say Susie said something, she could say in her dialogue, Frank and Clint, I don't think we should do that. And Susie's the one that said it. So there's little tricks and all. But the main thing is to not confuse the reader on that. Now, should you always say the word said? I've had people say, don't keep using the word said because it just gets tiresome. I've had other people say, use it. It's really invisible when people read. They just skim over it. It doesn't make any difference. I've had people say, add different words. Instead of saying said, saying commented, but say exclaimed. You have to be careful when you use other special words because if you go too far, you don't want to say, that John pontificated at all. There's certain words you can use that the reader will just kind of get turned off thinking you're just trying to show off big words. The bottom line is there's nothing wrong with using the word said. You should use it whenever you think it's necessary to clarify to the reader who's doing the talking. And If you think you want to use a different word, like mumbled or stammered, you can use it, but make sure it fits. It fits in what the character would say normally, and that the reader should understand it. It doesn't make you sound like you're trying to impress them with your large use of the vocabulary. There's a number of reasons you use dialogue, but primarily it's three purposes. That distinguishes your characters from one another. An obvious truth, we all talk in different accents, we have different education levels, we have different biases. Some of us are polite and courteous, others of us are rude. Please, no finger pointing out there. Some of us speak in a position of authority when speaking to our children or subordinates, and hopefully with some degree of respect when we talk to our parents or our supervisors. The way you have your characters talk to other characters can provide hints on your character's character. Dialogue also can help drive the plot forward. And I do think there's a lot to this. If you have two people talking, you don't have to have you don't have to say that Frank is Joe's boss. If Joe says something and it sounds like you're telling him to do something, and then Joe comes back and says, "Yes, sir, I'll get right to it." You kind of know then that Frank is some type of superior over Joe. Likewise, if they use crude and nasty words, you can show that someone's a bigot or someone is stupid or whatever in their vocabulary. It's a way to help the reader know more about the character than you just setting it in a long narration. It can drive the plot forward. Absolutely. Say, don't tell. This is kind of like my variation of show, don't tell when you're talking about dialogue. Rather than tell the reader that Susie can't swim as part of the narrative, you can include it in a dialogue. For example, Susie, what's wrong? Steve asks. I can't swim. I'll never reach the beach, Susie says as tears leak out of her eyes. It's a simple example, but what do you know? You learn right away she can't swim, and you learn right away that there's a dilemma here. Now you could write all that out in a paragraph to tell the reader, but it works better, I think, if you put it in dialogue. It serves the same purpose. It gives a little bit of an impression about the personality. Obviously, Susie's afraid and all, so you can use dialogue very easily this way. There's another example. Jake, I've never seen you shiver as violently as you are right now, Paul said. I left my winter jacket at home, Jake replied. So what does that tell you? Obviously, Jake is cold. It's cold outside. Uh, and Jake didn't get dressed up appropriately. You could also just put it in a paragraph and not have any dialogue. But I do think dialogue adds a little spice and a little more to the story than just writing it out in a long paragraph. How did your character speak? And that kind of goes back to telling you more about your character. But still, do they have a dialect? Do they have an accent? Are they uneducated? There's a number of things you can put in there that helps tell the reader or describe to the reader what your characters are like. Think of how your character would say things. For example, if he or she's not very educated, they probably won't go on with some, nuclear theory on how to create more power. They speak, and that's that's an extreme example, of course, but you should try to be like I think I have something in the middle I'll talk about. Stephen King said, "Be true to your characters." So when they talk, when they have conversations, and when make sure in your mind that was how and what your character would speak. I'd like to try to, create these. I don't know if I create them; they just create themselves in my mind. These little imaginary characters in my mind, and then I let them kind of grow and behave in a manner I think is appropriate. But in doing so, when I write dialogue, I can almost see one character speaking to another and what that character is doing and what the character, means, what he says. And then I know it's probably a simple explanation. Maybe all writers do that. But if you get in a habit of trying to get inside your character's head, it's easier to write dialogue. And then it's easier to assign certain types of behavior and personality to your character. Keep conversations or dialogue full of shorter sentences and shorter paragraphs. Unless your character is lecturing to someone like I'm doing now, or telling a long story, people don't talk in long paragraphs. And people do interrupt each other and they do change the subject. I don't know if I've ever watched people, and I do watch people talk just to learn from it, uh, that where if somebody starts talking too long, someone will just kind of butt in, ask a question, or, everybody wants to get their word out, get involved. So if it's a bunch of friends or peers, you don't get to dominate the conversation normally, unless everyone else is bored and they're thinking of something else. And that might be, you could fit that in your story. But if it's just normal people in normal conversation, people interrupt each other, people change the topic, and so forth. A good tip to follow is to say the dialogue out loud to make sure it sounds natural. Cut small talk and keep the dialogue brief and impactful. Create a unique character voice for each character and use word appropriate slang. Be consistent with the characters' voices and remember who they're speaking to. This goes back to, someone they love, someone they hate, someone they're afraid of, someone who's their boss. And avoid long dialogue paragraphs. This is just another paragraph that I got out of a textbook kind of thing. Additionally, it's important to give each character a purpose in the conversation to avoid forced conversation and info dumping. This goes back to not making it a long dialogue. Have someone else should have a role in that conversation, if to either help that person get to the point or change the subject or just cut into them now and then. Skipping greetings and small talk and keeping to 3 dialogue beats can also improve dialogue. I have to confess here, I'm not too sure what they mean when they said 3 dialogue beats, but the point is still good. You don't want to put a bunch of extraneous verbiage in your story or book that's not necessary. However, it needs to stay natural. It's very natural if Frank and Susie went into the restaurant to talk about how they're going to murder Susie's husband, whatever. They're still going to have a waiter come by and they're still going to order food and they're still going to have other small talk. So if you don't have some of that in there, you kind of take away the life of the character. So when I read these things about, it has to pertain to the story. Don't go off tangent and talk about something else. Whenever I read that writer's books or anything else, I see they do that too. Everyone goes off a little bit. The waiter comes up and they might say, "Hey, what do you have for beer tonight?" or something. So some of that stuff just helps the reader get a picture of the scene. Everything you do in writing should help your reader get a picture in his or her mind of what's going on in your book. And this can be done by dialogue very well too. Critically, in fiction, dialogue is important, but it can also help out in nonfiction. And where this comes in play is even in a memoir. You don't remember back in 1969 when you're on the Mekong River trying to get away from the bad guys, uh, what all was said to each other, but you know what happened. You know what the feelings of everybody there were, and you knew what they probably were talking about. So don't be afraid to put dialogue in your memoir that you're basically creating just from your memory. What a lot of authors do, and I recommend it, is early on in the book, or I mean at the very front or something, you can put a disclaimer in there that the facts of this story or this book are true to the best of my memory. Dialogue has been recreated, but is accurate as far as I can remember. Something like that to let your reader know that you acknowledge that no one can remember a conversation from 40 years ago, but you know what happened. You were there, they were there, and you knew what you were talking about, and you knew if they were afraid or they were happy, they were tired or what. So you can put dialogue, and it helps break up the story to give each character, each member, each person you're talking about in your book some type of life that the reader can get into too. It helps for the pace of the story. Even in strictly straight nonfiction, that's if you're writing a 5-page article, 10-page article, dialogue is not critical. But if you want to write a short book or even a long book about the history of motorcycles in America or the histories of Harley Davidsons or the history of the B-52, it's very easy to find what people said, quotations of old B-52 pilots talking about their thing. So you can use their dialogue and give them credit, of course, and you may have to cite a reference where you got it from. But by adding in some dialogue to that nonfiction history account, I think you enhance the overall story and you help the reader get a better feel for what you're trying to say. Like I said this earlier, but same thing. Don't forget who your character is. A private speaking to a colonel might talk differently than talking to another private. It could be the same person with the same accents and same everything, but the tone and the words they use and everything else are going to be influenced by whoever they're talking to. Don't worry about putting things in perfect English. I get a little bit riled up on reviews when I see people criticizing a book for broken sentences when a lot of those broken sentences, or most of them, are inside quotation marks. People don't always speak in perfect English. I know I don't. They talk in broken sentences, and they use words that may not be correct words, ain't, or something else. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. If as long as it's inside quotation marks and it makes sense and it's appropriate, whether or not it's a sentence without a subject or anything else, that's fine. And a reviewer should never knock you down for that. Slangs and dialects are fine, but as with everything else, don't overdo it and don't try to do too much of it if you're not very familiar with it yourself. I could never write and try to pretend like I knew how someone from New Orleans, a Cajun from the swamps there, would talk. I just don't know it. If I thought I did and I played with it, I know I'd screw it up. Also, if you put in foreign words, Spanish words, or French words, know what you're doing. It's very easy to misspell a word. It's very easy to, when two words look almost exactly alike, that you put in the wrong one. And so be careful when you start throwing in things that are outside your particular knowledge level. Okay? Listen to other people talk. I talked about this a little bit a few minutes ago, but I go out every morning almost to write. And what I used to do in the old days, I don't do it too much anymore, is I would kind of listen to other people conversations, not to listen to what they're saying. I'm not eavesdropping. I know I probably accuse me of it, but I don't care what they're talking about. I care more about how people interact and just kind of get a feel for the flow of conversation. You can do this at your own group. You have a party somewhere you go to and there's 20 people in the house. You walk around and mingle and just listen. You can do the same thing. But what you'll find out is groups of people, and they might even have two different conversations going on at the same time in the small group. I don't know how they do that, but some people are able to have a lot of conversations going on and follow each other. And then one person will step in and out of one conversation to join the conversation going on between two people right next to them in the same group. So all that kind of stuff you can play with when you write dialogue. Good dialogue, like everything else, takes practice to write, but get started and stay with it. All right, let's go ahead and do an exercise here. The first one, say take two people leaving to the airport. what can dialogue reveal about each character in a few lines? Now, these two people could be anybody you like. They could be two lovers, two teammates, two old friends, brother, sister, whatever. It doesn't make any difference who they are. That's up to you. But go ahead and write a couple lines of dialogue, what they might talk about. All right, you have 3 minutes. You go ahead and get started. You want to do a
Okay, so
break
what
here?
we'll do for those of you who are watching this recording is we'll pause. We want you to pause the recording, take the 3 minutes to complete the exercise, and then start it again.
The second exercise I have for y'all is a similar one. Again, you have two old friends now. So we know they're old friends. Meet years after having a falling out. What can dialogue reveal about each character in a few lines? Again, 3 minutes free write, and what we're trying to do, it doesn't matter what the falling out was about. It doesn't, matter, man, woman, whatever. But it's just write some dialogue, what they might do if they ever bounce back and saw each other again. I have questions. If you have any questions, now's the time to bring them up. We've got time. We can talk about them. We can address them. And I would suggest if you have some questions you want to email me later, feel free to do it.
Let me go ahead and cover some of at least one of the questions that we covered when we did this live. And we spent actually quite a bit of time talking about it. The question was from one of the viewers, how do you do dialogue when you're doing a story that's true, but it's historical? And we had a nice long discussion about that. Bob, you want to try to recreate that? I've got some of the stuff we talked about in my head.
Yeah, it goes back to what I was talking about a little while ago. Anything it's a historical event or historical topic, there are scholars, other historians, experts who have already looked into this. So it's very easy which you'll do anyway. If you're writing a historical, true account of something, you're bound to be doing research, which is appropriate. And if you find any research back there where somebody who was being interviewed said something about something, or just made comments about something, or their theory, I gave a theory on something, you can reuse those as long as you give credit to the person and to the source where it came from. And so it's a way to kind of add a dialogue, or at least some type of dialogue that could be used to help the story. It gives personality to the story itself. Okay.
So some of those sources that we talked about included, as Bob said, newspaper clippings, if you have a newspaper reporter who's done an interview. But if your historical stuff is relatively new, look at old movies. Look at old newsreels. Sometimes they'll have somebody answering questions and then you can quote them and you're absolutely accurate. On the other hand, when you're doing historical fiction, it's more often a creative nonfiction that you're doing. You know that they must have asked these kinds of questions, but you don't know if anybody did. You don't know exactly how they said it. So you have to paraphrase it. Don't
Right.
put it in quotation marks, or you just go, this was creative nonfiction.
Truman Capote really got that kicked off in his
That's
book
right.
In Cold Blood, and where he did a lot of research on a murder, famous, well, at least at the time, it was a famous murder, had a lot of publicity. And after they had caught the guys and they had done everything, the case was closed basically. He went back and wrote a novel, an account of what happened. He based it on facts, but he didn't have to. He chose to throw in dialogue that he had no real knowledge as to what was being said. And so he had enough research and questions and interviews that he knew everything that took place. But obviously, there was no tape recording of what was being said at the time. So his book got a lot of criticism, whether it was faxed or not faxed. And they finally decided the topic of that type of writing, or what would be called, is creative nonfiction. And there's a lot of other books like that now.
Yeah, and Valerie, who attended the first session, reminded everybody that there had been, and I didn't write the name down, but there was a woman that lives near her who gave a talk on creative nonfiction. There was lots of interest in that, and she took for action that she was going to ask that person to do one of these webinars. So if you're interested in how to do creative nonfiction, and especially the dialogue aspects of it, stay tuned to MWSA Education Series, and we'll be attempting to recruit her to give a presentation next cycle. There's also a
And
question uh, from John. John, do you want to ask the question? He stepped away. All right.
I'm here.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, two things. One is I remember somebody talk, especially when Bob was discussing how he went out and listened to people. And we all know that a lot of times conversations start off with things like, how are you doing? Okay.
right.
How's the family? So you could be realistic if you added all that, but that will definitely detract from the writing, even though it is realistic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can't do that all the time. But I don't think if you throw something in, uh, someone walks in the house you hadn't seen in a while, and they say, "How's everything going?" In a conversation, that doesn't harm the book. It's only if there's repeated instances where you throw in those kind of conversations, where it belabors the whole thing and takes away from the flow. Going back to the question about the 3-beat rule that I mentioned earlier, I couldn't remember. Basically, what it says is that in writing, specifically for dialogue, the 3-beat rule suggests limiting to 3 short phrases or beats of speech before inserting a dialogue tag, action beat, or another character's speech. This guideline helps writers maintain a natural pace and prevents overly long, convoluted dialogue.
Okay. That looks
Okay,
good.
so let's just wrap it up. Bob, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation today. And I want to remind everybody that there'll be another another education webinar in August. And there'll be in September a conference at in Kansas City. So if you want more information about our conference, about the website, about our education program, or about MWSA, and you want to become a member, go click on the website. John, what's the name of the website that they should go to?
That's the MWSAdispatches.com, and hope everyone can join us in Kansas City.
Yes, I look forward to seeing lots of you in Kansas City. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks again, Bob.
No problem. Good seeing you both.
Thank you.
Okay.